This episode of The Trail Went Cold is brought to you by our sponsor, Wink, whom we would like to thank for being such a great supporter of our show. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the U.S. a $20 credit plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. So please visit trywink.com/cold. That's trywinc.com/cold. Thank you and enjoy the show.
October 23rd, 1986. Dublin, Ireland. After going home for lunch, 13-year-old Philip Cairns leaves in order to return to school. He never arrives and vanishes without a trace. 6 days later, Philip's school bag appears in an alley which had previously been searched, leading to speculation that it was planted there by whoever was responsible for his disappearance. In 2016, investigators receive information to suggest that a dying pedophile named Eamon Cooke murdered Philip. But even though he is questioned on his deathbed, Cooke passes away before he can provide any answers, and no conclusive evidence links him to the crime. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering a famous missing persons case from across the Atlantic, the 1986 disappearance of Philip Cairns. That voice you just heard narrating our opening was Aine Noonan, the winner of our latest Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, and she did an awesome job, so thank you very much, Anya. This has become a popular recurring monthly contest for our podcast, and if you would like to learn how to enter, I will provide you with all the details near the end of this episode. Anyway, since Anya is a listener who was originally born in Ireland, I thought this would be a good opportunity to cover a case from that part of the world. This one was originally suggested to me sometime last year by a listener named Lonnie, and is one of the most famous missing children's cases in the history of Ireland. It involves a 13-year-old schoolboy named Philip Cairns who went home for lunch one day, but then vanished without explanation after leaving to go back to school. Of course, Philip's disappearance sent shockwaves throughout the community because it was apparent that he had been abducted by an unknown assailant. Stranger abductions of children were extremely rare in Ireland, and up until this point, parents never really believed that something like this could happen to their child in broad daylight. In recent years, one of Ireland's worst pedophiles has been linked to Philip's case, but since he died shortly thereafter, it is still up in the air about whether or not he was the actual perpetrator. Anyway, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is now on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and personalized thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved disappearance of Philip Cairns. Our story begins in Dublin, Ireland in 1986. Our central figure is 13-year-old Philip Cairns, who lives in the suburb of Rathfarnham with his parents, Alice and Philip Sr., along with his 4 sisters and younger brother. Philip is a student at Clochdanis Secondary School and his daily routine is to go home during his lunch hour. At 12:45 p.m. on October 23rd, Philip went to his house on Ballyroan Road for lunch, before leaving to make the 15-minute walk back to school at 1:30. But he never arrived, and this would turn out to be the last time anyone ever saw him. When Philip didn't return home that evening, his parents reported him missing to the Irish police, aka the Gardaí, who mounted a large-scale search operation for the boy. The Cairns family even convinced local milk companies to have their drivers circulate missing posters for Philip during their deliveries. Since Philip was known for being a quiet, reserved boy who never caused any trouble, his parents did not believe he would have willingly got into a vehicle with a stranger and suspected that he was abducted by someone he knew and trusted. Even though their midterm holiday break took place the week after Philip went missing, his fellow students voluntarily went to their school on October 29th in order to be interviewed by the Gardaí. Later that night, there would be a surprising development when two teenage girls discovered Philip's school bag in a laneway located a few hundred yards from his home. This baffled investigators, as the bag was in a visible spot, and the laneway had been searched multiple times during the preceding 6 days. In fact, one of the two girls who found it claimed she had walked through the laneway earlier that same day, but did not see the bag. If that wasn't enough, the bag was completely dry, even though there had been frequent rain throughout the previous week. This led to speculation that it was recently planted there by whoever was responsible for Philip's disappearance. Some of Philip's school supplies, such as his journal and writing implements, were still inside the bag, but 3 of his school books, 1 about geography and 2 about religion, were conspicuously missing. However, the bag failed to provide any clues about Philip's whereabouts, though it would be locked away and preserved inside a safe for the next 3 decades. Weeks later, the Gardaí were contacted by a motorist who reported a potential sighting of Philip at around 1:30 on the afternoon of his disappearance. He remembered seeing a boy matching Philip's description, dressed in a grey school jumper and carrying a bag, at the corner of Ballyroan Road and Ballyroan Crescent. The boy was approaching the passenger side door of a red car, possibly a Renault or a Mazda, which was being driven by a man described as being approximately 50 years old with grey hair sticking up. The motorist had actually written down the registration number of the vehicle because it was badly parked and obstructing traffic. Unfortunately, he went to the airport shortly thereafter, and while he was away, his wife cleaned out his car and threw out the piece of paper containing the registration number, so he no longer had it by the time he made the connection to Philip's disappearance. Anyway, in October of 1989, the Irish newspaper, the Sunday Independent, published an article about the case which alleged that the driver of this red car was a local man Philip knew and trusted, which is why he accepted a ride with him. The article also alleged that whoever planted Philip's school bag in the laneway made the calculated decision to remove his books about religion. Following his disappearance, there were wild, unsubstantiated rumors that Philip had been abducted by a religious sect or cult, so removing the religion books may have been a ploy to lend credence to these rumors. After the publication of the article, the Gardaí received 4 anonymous calls from an individual who provided the name and address for the man who was supposedly responsible for Philip's disappearance. While they made arrangements to meet the anonymous caller, he never showed up, but it's unknown how thoroughly the suspect he named in his calls was investigated. In November of 2002, the Sunday Independent published another article about the case that alleged that Philip had been murdered because he was being abused by someone outside his family and attempted to confide this in another man. However, this other man was also abusing children, so he informed Philip's abuser that the child had talked, which subsequently led to Philip being murdered and buried in a pond on the grounds of the Loreto Abbey Convent. By the time the article was published, the land had been sold by the Loreto Order, and the 2 ponds which were on the property had since been built over with a tennis and basketball court and a retirement home. However, the lead never went anywhere, and there is some debate about whether the ponds on this property were actually drained and built over before Philip even went missing. In May of 2009, there was an interesting development when the Gardaí sealed off a private wooded stretch of land on Whitechurch Road located next to a golf club in Rathfarnham. A search was conducted after investigators received a tip from an elderly woman who claimed that a man she was once involved in a relationship with had confessed to murdering Philip and burying his remains on those 2 sections of land. Unfortunately, the search failed to turn up anything, and while the alleged suspect was still alive and living in Rathfarnham at that time, no evidence could be found to prove he was involved in Philip's disappearance. The case hit a standstill again, and sadly, Philip Cairns Sr. would pass away in July of 2014 without ever finding out what happened to his son. But as the 30th anniversary of Philip's disappearance approached, the investigation would be hit with a major bombshell. In June of 2016, it was announced that Eamon Cooke, a convicted pedophile who had been serving time in Arbor Hill Prison, was being investigated as a possible suspect after a witness came forward who placed Cooke with Philip on the day he disappeared. By this point, Cooke had already achieved a large amount of notoriety. He was a former television repairman who found fame during the 1970s after becoming a disc jockey in a pirate radio station called Radio Dublin. In case you haven't heard of the term before, pirate radio involves broadcasting without a valid license, and pirate radio stations were quite prevalent in Ireland for decades since there wasn't much in the way of legitimate commercial radio available. Anyway, Cooke broadcast under the name Captain Cooke, and after attaining a popular cult following, he eventually assumed ownership of Radio Dublin and broadcasted out of a studio at his home in the suburb of Inchicore. But in spite of his success, disturbing rumors began to circulate about Cooke's personal conduct, as he frequently had children hanging around his studio, and it was suspected that he would lure them there to sexually abuse them. In 1978, while Cooke was away on holiday, a young girl was convinced to make a recording which detailed her abuse at his hands. In response, the entire staff of Radio Dublin orchestrated a mutiny and quit, and they also sabotaged the station's transmitter. When Cooke returned, he publicly denied the allegations on his radio show, and the controversy soon died down. The story goes that a local priest visited the girl's parents and convinced them that reporting her abuse would have a negative effect on the family. So Cooke continued on with his career, but his misdeeds finally caught up with him in 2002 when he was arrested and publicly outed as a serial child abuser who was often referred to by his nickname, the Cookie Monster. He would be convicted on 33 charges, which included the attempted rape, attempted unlawful carnal knowledge, and sexual and indecent assault of 4 girls. After serving 3 years in prison, Cooke would have his conviction quashed on a technicality and was released, but he would be back on trial again in 2007. This time, he would be convicted on 42 separate charges, which stemmed from the repeated abuse of 2 of the same female victims from his previous trial, which took place over a 4-year period during the 1970s. Cooke was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but would wind up back in the news again after a witness came forward who implicated him in Philip Cairns' disappearance. The female witness also claimed to have been sexually abused by Cooke, and was only 9 years old at the time Philip went missing. Her story was that Cooke knew Philip personally and had lured him to his studio for Radio Dublin in Inchicore. The witness said she was in another room when she heard some loud noise inside the studio. When she went inside, the girl claimed she saw Philip lying bleeding on the floor because Cooke had struck the boy with an implement. She subsequently fainted over this, and when she woke up, she was inside Cooke's car, but never saw Philip again. By the time the witness shared the story 3 decades later, the Radio Dublin studio had been demolished and replaced with an apartment block. Regardless, the Gardaí found her story to be credible and wanted to question Cooke, but the problem is that he was dying of lung cancer and had been transferred out of prison into hospice care. He was also suffering from dementia and practically on death's door by the time investigators spoke to him. The actual content of their conversations together has never been publicly disclosed, but it's been reported that Cooke mostly just provided yes and no answers. However, he also allegedly gave details which seem to corroborate the witness's story and suggest that he might have had some knowledge of Philip's disappearance. Cooke was offered the chance to privately confess the location of Philip's body to a solicitor or a priest, who in turn would provide this information to detectives after he died. But this never came to fruition. He never did reveal what happened to Philip, and passed away on June 4, 2016, at the age of 79. 2 days after his death, one of Cooke's family members would discover a handwritten letter inside a storage unit he owned, containing the words, "Sorry to Philip for everything that happened." In parts of the letter, Cooke referred to his quote-unquote son Philip, but even though he had a total of 11 children throughout his life, he never had a son named Philip. It's believed that Cooke originally wrote the note in around 2004-2005 while he was locked up in prison, and then put the note inside the storage unit after his conviction was quashed and he was released. Even so, it could not be conclusively determined if the note was referring to Philip Cairns. Shortly thereafter, Philip's school bag was taken out of storage so that Cooke's DNA could be compared with touch DNA samples from the bag. They did not match, but in spite of this, investigators stated that they have not ruled out Cooke as a suspect. From their inquiries, they came to believe that Cooke might have coerced 2 or more children into planting the bag in the laneway, so they sent out a public appeal for anyone with information to come forward. The story took a surprising turn when noted radio presenter and author Gareth O'Callaghan became involved in the case. Even though he did not know the Cairns family, O'Callaghan claimed that he was a distant relative of Philip's and had also briefly worked at Radio Dublin for Eamon Cooke during the late 1970s. O'Callaghan did not actually believe that Cooke was responsible for Philip's disappearance, and said he had been contacted by numerous people, some of whom were former schoolmates of Philip's, who claimed they had been sexually abused by an organized pedophile ring which operated in South Dublin during the 1970s and 80s. In addition, O'Callaghan also said he was contacted by a gardener who told him that a deceased man he used to work for was a member of this ring and suspected that this man was involved in Philip's murder and had buried his remains in his garden. O'Callaghan believed a cover-up had taken place and stated, quote, "This is a ring of individuals who have protected this case," end quote. Well, in December of 2016, one of Philip's sisters, Sandra Cairns, publicly spoke out against a social media campaign in which conspiracy theorists discussed his disappearance and portrayed Philip in a manner that was, quote-unquote, deeply disrespectful and distressing. While Sandra never mentioned Gareth O'Callaghan by name, he suspected she was referring to his Facebook page, so O'Callaghan responded by issuing a public apology to the Cairns family and vowed not to make any more posts about Philip. Ever since then, the investigation into Philip Cairns' disappearance has once again hit a complete standstill. The Gardaí have yet to recover Philip's remains or find any conclusive evidence which proves that he was murdered by Eamon Cooke. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I think now would be an ideal time to pour myself a glass of wine and propose another toast to our wonderful sponsor, Winc, who have always been great supporters of our podcast. Winc is targeting a new generation of wine drinkers who want to do away with the pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced, great wine. Winc custom tailors wines to the taste of the individual consumer and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus free shipping. When you visit Winc and take their 20-second palate profile quiz, you'll get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. The price point for most wines is $13, so by signing up with Winc, you are getting your first bottle for free. Winc is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the US a $20 credit plus free shipping on your first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Winc. Your wine delivery will be branded Winc. Winc is the wine club associated with Winc. So let's see, I need to find another vintage of wine for our toast. They have such a large selection to choose from. Here's a good one, and I love the title. A 2017 bottle of Rogue Admiral's Shiraz. It's from the limestone coast of Australia, an area rich in soils that produce phenomenal site-specific wines. This Shiraz reflects the nature of the area with a full-bodied, velvety red that roars with herbal, peppery notes and bold tannins. A delicious bottle from an exciting region, this is a wine for when you want to go rogue. It's best served at room temperature and pairs up great with burgers, ribs, and chocolate cake. So to receive a $20 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine just like this one on your first order, go to trywinc.com/cold. That's trywinc.com/cold. trywinc.com/cold. So let's raise our glasses high, and here's a toast to Winc. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of our show. Well, it's easy to see why this has become one of the most famous missing persons cases in the history of Ireland. Sadly, unsolved abductions involving missing children in North America are all too common, but like I mentioned in the intro, they are incredibly rare in Ireland. In fact, in the 2010 book, Missing, Ireland's Disappeared, it was written that Philip Cairns and the 1977 disappearance of 7-year-old Mary Boyle remain the only unsolved missing children's cases in Ireland that are non-parental abductions. What's particularly shocking about Philip's case is that it took place in the middle of the afternoon in an area which was fairly busy most of the time, but other than a witness who thought they might have seen a boy resembling Philip approach a parked car, no one saw anything. Much like the episode I did a few months ago about the disappearance of Trevor Deely in downtown Dublin, Philip just seemed to vanish into thin air. Now, this will be the first Trail Went Cold episode which tackles the unpleasant subject of organized pedophile rings, a theory which is often brought up when young boys go missing and are never found. Perhaps the most famous example of this in North America is the 1982 disappearance of 12-year-old Johnny Gosch, who vanished during a paper route through his neighborhood, and whose case has since spiraled off into a major rabbit hole involving conspiracy theories about him and other young victims being forced into a massive child prostitution ring intended to service rich, powerful pedophiles. Another famous case like this, which I may cover on the podcast someday, took place in London in 1979 when 15-year-old Martin Allen vanished on his way home from school, and in recent years, his disappearance has also ventured into conspiracy theory territory, with allegations of him being forced into an organized pedophile ring. And of course, rumors about a pedophile ring have recently surfaced in Philip Cairns' case, though I'm not sure how much credence should be put into them. Sadly, in most cases involving missing children, the most logical explanation is that the victim was simply abducted by a lone predator and murdered shortly thereafter, and that there was no organized conspiracy. We have a very promising suspect here, as Eamon Cooke was one of the worst sexual predators imaginable, but since he died shortly after the allegations against him surfaced, they've yet to conclusively prove whether he did it or not. But before we talk about Eamon Cooke, let's start from the very beginning. It's obvious that Philip was abducted shortly after he left his house to walk back to school, and it had to happen in a very narrow window of time. Since Philip was described as being a quiet, reserved child who was unlikely to have gotten into a vehicle with a stranger, his family have always subscribed to the theory that Philip was taken by someone he knew and trusted. And that makes sense to me, because if he climbed into a vehicle voluntarily rather than being snatched off the street, this would explain why no one reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. The closest we have to an eyewitness sighting is the motorist who saw a boy matching Philip's description heading towards the passenger side door of a parked red car. While we can't be 100% certain that this boy was Philip, the way he described him as wearing a gray school jumper and carrying a bag lends credence to the idea that it was him, and since the sighting occurred sometime around 1:30 p.m., the timeline would match. The driver was described as being around 50 years old with gray hair that stood up, but it's unclear if Philip knew anybody by that description at that time who drove a red car. It certainly doesn't sound like it rang any bells with his family. But what's interesting is that the description of the driver does seem to match Eamon Cooke, who would have been around 50 years old at that time and had grayish hair which was often unkempt and stuck up. However, I'm not sure if he was driving a red car in 1986. Now, of course, the most baffling aspect of this case is the sudden reappearance of Philip's school bag in the laneway 6 days after he went missing. The evidence clearly showed that it could not have been there the entire time, and that it had to be planted there by someone shortly before it was found. This could have been done by the perpetrator, either to mislead investigators or simply to toy with everyone. But I guess it's also possible that an innocent bystander who had no involvement in Philip's disappearance could have found it somewhere, and for whatever reason, possibly due to an unwillingness to get involved with the Gardaí, they decided to plant it at a spot near where Philip went missing, rather than come forward to turn it in. Whoever left it there, the one thing I can't figure out is why 3 of Philip's school books were missing. I know there was speculation this was done intentionally, in order to lend credence to the rumors that Philip had been abducted by a cult or religious sect. Those rumors were pretty ridiculous, and hung over the case for a while, but this was still only 6 days after he went missing, so I don't know how prevalent the rumors were at this point. The The missing books are the main reason I believe the bag was left there by the perpetrator rather than an innocent bystander, and if they were really twisted, perhaps they just wanted to keep the books as a memento of what they'd done. This might also support the idea that the perpetrator lived in the area. If they lived elsewhere and were just passing through Rathfarnham when they abducted Philip, it seems awfully brazen for them to return there to drop off a key piece of evidence in a visible spot, especially when there's a risk of them being seen. Anyway, over the course of the past 3 decades, the Gardaí have received a number of tips about what happened to Philip, and they've conducted searches for his body, but nothing has ever been substantiated. One of the most intriguing allegations is that Philip had been sexually abused and confided in someone about this, but this person warned the abuser, and they conspired to murder Philip. If Philip really was being abused prior to his disappearance, and his family didn't know about it, then I could see one or more people working together to cover the whole thing up. But as far as I can tell, Philip never gave off any indication that something was wrong. Yes, this was a much different time period, as opening up about being a sexual abuse victim was still a pretty taboo subject, so it is possible the Cairns family could have missed some warning signs. But I'm inclined to think that the person responsible for Philip's disappearance was someone who had never abused him prior to that day, and Philip was taken by complete surprise when it happened. So now we'll move on to the big unanswered question. Was this person Eamon Cooke? Well, the guy was undoubtedly an evil monster who got away with his crimes for way too long. In fact, when you consider that he only received a 10-year prison sentence when he was convicted back in 2007, it's frightening to think that if he had not passed away, he would have been released and back on the streets by now. Some parallels can definitely be made between Cooke and the famous British entertainer Jimmy Savile, who also started off his career as a disc jockey and became a prominent figure in radio. As you probably know, after his death in 2011, a major scandal came to light when it was revealed that Savile was one of the most prolific sexual predators in history, and allegations surfaced that he abused hundreds of victims, many of whom were children. Of course, there had been accusations and rumors about Savile's behavior for decades, but the guy was pretty much untouchable, so his abuse was covered up, and he never had to face justice for his crimes while he was alive. While Eamon Cooke was nowhere near as famous as Savile was, he was able to get away with his abuse for a long time, and no one really knows how many victims he had. On the surface, he seems like an ideal suspect in Philip's disappearance, and even though he's never been linked to any murders, a lot of people think he might have been capable of it. After the murder allegations surfaced, one of Cooke's daughters stepped forward to publicly defend him. Now, she certainly wasn't defending his actions at all, as she herself was sexually abused by him when she was a child. But even though she believed he was capable of abusing any child he crossed paths with, she did not believe he was capable of murder. She also spent time with her father during the last days of his life, and does not put much stock into anything he might have said to the Gardaí. According to his daughter, Cooke didn't even know who half of his own children were at this point, and claimed that the last time she visited him in hospice, he didn't even know where he was. If he said anything to investigators to incriminate himself in Philip's disappearance, she did not think it should be taken as a confirmation that he was involved. Another reason some people are skeptical that Cooke was the perpetrator is that he was not known for preying on young boys, and his only confirmed victims are girls. But the key phrase here is confirmed victims. For all we know, Cooke could have sexually abused boys during his lifetime, but none of them ever came forward to publicly share their story. Before Cooke was charged in 2002, the Gardaí performed an extensive investigation and interviewed at least 5 boys who were believed to be victims of his sexual abuse, but none of them were willing to make a formal statement. In fact, during the late 1990s, one male victim did make a statement against Cooke, but then later decided to withdraw it. Throughout his life, Jimmy Savile sexually abused boys, girls, and adults, so serial sexual predators like him and Cooke are capable of preying on anyone in order to satisfy their urges. So just because Philip was a boy does not mean that Cooke wouldn't have targeted him. Now, if Cooke did abduct Philip, it's possible that he did not initially intend to kill him. According to the female witness, he struck Philip with some type of implement, but she was not actually in the room when this happened. It's possible that when Cooke attempted to molest Philip, the boy fought off his advances, so Cooke grabbed the nearest object and struck Philip with it. It's not entirely clear whether Philip was dead or just unconscious on the floor when the girl entered the room, but if Cooke caused a fatal injury, or he was paranoid that Philip would talk about the incident if he let him go, he decided he had to get rid of him. Cooke did own land in the Dublin mountains, which could have conceivably been used to dispose of a body, though a search of this land by the Gardaí has turned up nothing. So I guess whether or not you believe Cooke was the perpetrator depends on how much credence you put into the witness's story. When she spoke to investigators, they found her to be credible, and you'd really hate to accuse someone who was allegedly sexually abused as a child to be fabricating a story. All that being said, there are some aspects of her story which prevent me from believing with 100% certainty that Cooke was responsible. To me, the thing I find most odd is that this attack supposedly took place inside the studio of Radio Dublin. According to the witness, Cooke lured Philip to the studio in order to abuse him, and this part is definitely believable. For decades, children were constantly seen hanging around Radio Dublin, and I'm sure the promise of showing them around a radio station is how Cooke lured many of his victims. Now, Philip lived in Rathfarnham, and the Radio Dublin studio was in Inchicore, which is about a 15 to 20 minute drive away. Even though the witness seems to think Cooke knew Philip beforehand, it sounds like Philip never mentioned him to his family, or anything about knowing a guy who owned a radio station. Let's just assume that the eyewitness account from the motorist who saw the boy approaching the red car is accurate, and that Cooke was the driver. Cooke could have pulled up beside Philip, asked him if he wanted a tour of his radio station, and then drove him there. That might sound tempting for a young boy, but the problem is that Philip was on his way back to school at this point. According to his family, Philip was not known for causing trouble, and even if he really wanted to go to the radio station, it sounds like it would have been out of character for him to skip school in order to do so. But then again, kids are capable of keeping secrets and doing things behind their parents' back, so if he was already acquainted with Cooke beforehand and trusted him, then maybe they just didn't know about it. All that being said, here's the one aspect of the witness's story which I find most questionable. How could Cooke have violently attacked and murdered someone inside his radio studio without anybody seeing anything? Philip went missing in the middle of the afternoon on a Thursday, so you'd have to assume that Radio Dublin would have been on the air at this time. And if Cooke was out in another part of the city abducting Philip, then someone else would have to be operating his station. People who visited Radio Dublin during its heyday have remarked how there always seemed to be lots of people around there, and I'm sure that would have been the case on a Thursday afternoon. The only witness who has reported seeing anything is this young girl, who claims she fainted after finding Philip's body on the floor, and that when she woke up, she was inside Cooke's car. If true, this would mean that Cooke had to remove a dead boy and an unconscious girl from his studio, so how exactly was the station functioning while all this was going on? Unless Cooke had one or more accomplices who helped him cover up the crime and have remained silent all these years, I'm just having a hard time seeing how these events transpired. It's actually too bad that the Radio Dublin studio was destroyed a long time ago. If records were still available, it would be interesting to see what their programming schedule was on October 23rd, 1986. Because if Cooke was actually on the air hosting one of his shows between 1:30 and 2 o'clock that afternoon, then this gives him an airtight alibi, and there's no way he could have been in Rathfarnham abducting Philip. However, after all these years, I'm not sure if this information is still available. But here's one piece of info which is verifiable. Just 2 days before Philip went missing, Cooke was in Dublin Circuit Criminal Court for an unrelated incident. In 1984, Cooke decided to launch an attack on a former Radio Dublin employee named John Paul O'Toole. O'Toole had started dating a young woman whom Cooke had sexually abused in the past, and she also happened to be the mother of one of his children. In retaliation, Cooke paid 4 thugs to throw a petrol bomb into O'Toole's flat. They all faced charges for this, and on October 21st, 1986, Cooke appeared in court to plead guilty to conspiring to assault O'Toole. A plea was made not to impose a prison sentence on Cooke, as he, quote-unquote, could suffer a great financial loss in the event of radio licensing legislation being introduced. Well, on October 22nd, the 4 thugs Cooke hired all received 4-year suspended sentences. Cooke's sentencing was deferred, but he would also receive a 4-year suspended sentence on November 3rd. Now, I don't know if it's just a coincidence that these events just happened to take place around the exact same time Philip went missing, but this does seem like an odd time for Cooke to decide to abduct and murder a child. Cooke's accomplices in the firebombing received suspended sentences the very day before Philip disappeared, but it was still up in the air whether Cooke was going to receive the same sentence and avoid prison time. So would he really take the risk of abducting a child in broad daylight while he's waiting for this sentence to be handed down? Not only that, but Cooke was a fairly recognizable figure because of Radio Dublin, and I believe his picture had recently been published in the paper over his guilty plea in the firebombing case. So what if someone saw his face and connected him to Philip's disappearance? You'd think Cooke would want to wait until these legal troubles were behind him before he started preying on children again. But then again, if Cooke wasn't sure he was going to receive a suspended sentence and that he could potentially get locked up, maybe he felt this was his last opportunity to prey on a young victim for a while, which is why he brazenly abducted Philip. That's the thing with serial pedophiles. Their brains do not function like a normal person, as satisfying their urges can take priority over logic. This could have been one of the reasons why Cooke decided to kill Philip, as he did not want the boy talking while he was facing a potential prison sentence. Anyway, like I said earlier, I don't want to accuse this female witness of making up her story, especially since investigators find her to be believable, so she may have shared specific details which have not been publicly released and add credibility to her account. Apparently, Cooke did share details on his deathbed which seemed to corroborate the witness's story, but how much stock can you put into the words of a dementia patient in hospice care? This is reminiscent of the episode I released a few months ago about the disappearance of Marine Fields, where DNA evidence was matched to a suspect named Keith Wayne Holmes. Like Cooke, Holmes was questioned while he was in hospice care, suffering from dementia, so nothing he said could be taken as concrete evidence. Now the thing about Cooke is that I'm not sure he ever admitted to any of the horrible things he did throughout his life. Even after he was convicted on the sexual abuse charges, he continued to maintain that the accusations against him were false and that he was completely innocent. Cooke was described as a narcissistic, sociopathic individual, and they aren't inclined to admit when they've done anything wrong. However, if he was no longer lucid because of his dementia, then perhaps he might have inadvertently revealed things which he otherwise might never have admitted to. Since the Gardaí have never disclosed the exact nature of their conversations with Cooke, we still don't know what kind of details he might have shared. The most intriguing piece of evidence which might seem to implicate Cooke is the note found in his storage locker which read, "Sorry to Philip for everything that happened," as it doesn't sound like Cooke had any known connection to anyone named Philip. While Cooke never expressed any remorse for his sex crimes, if he did cross the line and killed one of his victims, that might have been the one thing he felt regretful about. It's strange how he supposedly wrote this note in prison and then placed it inside his storage unit after his conviction was quashed. Perhaps this is the closest thing to a confession that a monster like Cooke can make. He will not flat out admit that he murdered Philip, but he'll leave this cryptic note behind in his storage unit and hope that someone will find it and put the pieces together after he's dead. The one piece of evidence which doesn't implicate Cooke is Philip's school bag, since no traces of his DNA were found on it. Of course, this doesn't exonerate him, since it's rumored that Cooke coerced some other children into planting the bag at that location. If Cooke really did murder Philip at his radio station in Inchicore, then he may have decided to return the bag to Rathfarnham in order to lead the investigation away from him and make everyone believe that the perpetrator lived in that area. I think our best hope for solving this case is if the rumor about Cooke getting children to plant the bag is true. Now that these kids are adults, they might feel comfortable coming forward and confirming this information. Lastly, we should address Gareth O'Callaghan's allegations that Cooke had no involvement in Philip's disappearance and that the child was murdered by an organized pedophile ring. Now, if you look up O'Callaghan's background, you'll see that he's a pretty controversial, outspoken figure in Ireland. I'm not sure how much credence I would put in his allegations, as most of them were made through posts on his Facebook page and contain unsubstantiated information. Even though O'Callaghan claimed to be a distant relative of Philip's, his mother, Alice Cairns, claimed she never met him. She urged him to go to the Gardaí if he had any important information, but O'Callaghan said he would only do so if the people who shared this info with him gave him their blessing. To his credit, he stopped posting about Philip's case once it became apparent that he was causing distress to the Cairns family, but this angle has pretty much reached a dead end. While I have no doubt that some terrible cases of sexual abuse have been covered up in Ireland these past several decades, I don't think there's an organized conspiracy or cover-up when it comes to Philip's disappearance. Unlike the Johnny Gosch or Martin Allen cases, even though there are rumors of an organized pedophile ring being involved, there's no indication that Philip was still alive at any point after he went missing, or that he was used as some sort of child prostitute. I just think it's a simple case of him being abducted by a sole predator who murdered the boy before disposing of his remains. I guess it's possible that more than one person knows the truth about what happened to Philip, but I doubt that there's some massive organized conspiracy, or that the Gardaí are covering the whole thing up. Let's put it this way. I'm not entirely sure if Eamon Cooke is the perpetrator, but if the Gardaí really wanted to close the books on this case, it would have been so easy to pin the crime on him. Either falsely claim that he made a full deathbed confession, or plant his DNA on Philip's school bag, or done anything which would have allowed them to say with 100% certainty that Cooke did it. But they haven't done this. While they do acknowledge that Cooke might have been responsible, they're still keeping the investigation open until some conclusive evidence emerges which either implicates or exonerates Cooke. I'm honestly not sure about what to think of Cooke as a suspect. The guy was clearly a monster, and there are some things which make me think he could have done this, but there are some other pieces which don't quite fit. If it could be proven that Cooke and Philip met and knew each other prior to his disappearance, then I'd feel comfortable believing that he's the guy. But there's a lot to suggest that Philip was murdered by someone he knew and trusted, and if he didn't know Eamon Cooke, I'm not sure he would have been comfortable enough to climb into a car with him. Either way, I'm glad that the Gardaí are still keeping the books open on this one, and since they still have DNA evidence on Philip's school bag, it could potentially be matched to someone and provide answers about who exactly was responsible for this. The whole thing is so tragic for Philip Cairns' family, who have handled this awful situation with class and dignity these past 3 decades. It must be so frustrating to know that there is a promising suspect who is now deceased, but they just don't have the evidence to prove with absolute certainty that it was him. They deserve to have full closure and to find Philip's remains and give him a proper burial. So if you happen to have any information about the unsolved disappearance of Philip Cairns, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, another special thanks to Aine Noonan for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. If you've already entered our monthly contest before, you are automatically eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter, and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that the Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've released some neat bonus episodes for our donors in tiers 2 and 3, and we'll be releasing another one this month, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. And I'd also like to take a moment to catch up on thanking our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past couple weeks. So a big shout out to Sean G, Rob M, Suzanne K, Katie T, Lori B, Martin M, Caitlin E, Zoe K, Kenny F, Victoria B, Patrick, Trey F, Michael S, Valerian, and the Reigns of Yesteryear. Thank you so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. I need to provide my thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. And just one more reminder that this coming weekend, I will be at the Canadian Crime Podcast event, a live show being held at the Hideout Bar in Toronto on Sunday, July 22nd, which will include myself and a number of other Canadian true crime podcasters and some very special guests. If you want some last-minute tickets, they are only $10, and you can find a link to our Eventbrite page to purchase them in our episode description. Anyway, if you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.